All right, so this is completely unexpected, but we're here to talk about Star Wars Episode 10, 11, 12, maybe. Let's dive into this because this is really interesting. So, Star Wars has been, well, it's been in a little bit of a state of turmoil, let's say. In the last week's episode of the Access Blockbusters Pod, we talked about updates on all of the movies that Star Wars has been, it's supposed to be working on, but then, we find out that the Rey Skywalker movie is being delayed because lost its writer, but then James Mangold's Dawn of the Jedi movie is moving along, we think, and then Mandalorian Grogu is coming out. So who knows where we are with those movies, honestly. It's just kind of all up in the air. But, the Rey Skywalker movie had been really interesting because it was a question of, okay, so if it's not episode 10, which is fine, it doesn't have to be episode 10, what is it, really? Is it just sort of a standalone thing they wanted to tell after episode 9? Is it sort of a redemption thing for Rey? Wait, what is this Rey Skywalker movie? And is it ever going to lead to an episode 10? Is episode 10 even going to be related to Rey Skywalker or the Skywalkers at all? I don't even know. It's really interesting, right? So then, the other day, news broke, and this is really interesting, that there are going to be 3 new Star Wars movies as part of a trilogy being developed by Simon Kinberg. And by the way, this is not a rumor because, I've said this many times on the Access Blockbusters Pod and on the channel before. I don't cover scoops. I don't cover, scoopers as if they're news. Like, I'll talk about something a scooper said, like, in the past week I talked about the Midnight Suns rumored movie, not because it's news, but because I think it's fun to then speculate on other things related to that, like what I think the roster would be like, et cetera, et cetera. But this isn't a scoop. This is coming from Deadline and The Hollywood Reporter, which are, for those of you who don't follow the movie news trades that much, Deadline, Hollywood Reporter, Variety are very, very reliable sources. They almost always are correct. And even if the thing they report doesn't end up being true, eventually, it's almost always certain that what they heard at the time was what was true at the time. So this is pretty much as close to confirmation as you can get without Star Wars and Lucasfilm coming out and saying this is what's happening. So Simon Kinberg is developing a new trilogy of Star Wars movies that he is going to write and executive produce, it looks like. Okay, and now here it gets interesting, right? As Anakin Skywalker once infamously said, this is where the fun begins, because there are now conflicting reports between Deadline and The Hollywood Reporter about what this is going to look like. So I believe it was Deadline sources say that, in fact, these 3 films are going to be episodes 10, 11, and 12. Okay, interesting. I believe Deadline also said that these are not going to be a continuation, of the Skywalker saga and that they're going to be different. The Hollywood Reporter, I believe, is refuting that and saying that this is not going to be episodes 10 through 12, and it's obviously, if it's not episode 10 through 12, it's obviously not going to be part of the Skywalker saga. So they're on agreement on one thing. This is really not going to be a continuation of the Skywalker saga, whatever these 3 films are. And I think Deadline was the one who said there is still potential for characters from the Skywalker saga to show up. So, maybe this takes place 40 years later. I don't know if that means Daisy Ridley won't be coming back and it'll be a much older Rey or something like that. I don't know. It's hard to say, right? Because we know next to nothing about what this is. I mean, even the major trades, which are usually all in agreement, are disagreeing about what this is. So it's hard to say how far in the future this is going to be. It seems like if old characters could show up, it's not going to be 600 years in the future, which I honestly think could be kind of fun. I had this wild theory a while ago, you can check it out on the channel somewhere, that episode 10 was going to be, 600 years in the future, but Grogu was going to be the new Yoda, and it was kind of, George Lucas's famous quote, right? It's like poetry, it rhymes. Anyways, I don't think that's what's going to happen either. We'll see. But yeah, so that's interesting, right? Is it part of the Skywalker saga? Is it not? And then are old characters going to show up? Are they not? Is this episodes 10 through 12 or is it not? There are a lot of questions up in the air. So there are a couple things, in addition to that we should talk about here, because I think that this is interesting news. Like, what do we know for sure? We know for sure that, and I say for sure, as far as, Deadline and The Hollywood Reporter have confirmed, we know for sure, quote unquote, that there are going to be 3 new Star Wars movies as part of a trilogy, and Simon Kinberg is going to be writing and executive producing that. Now, the other big part of this is, so who is Simon Kinberg, right? For those of you who don't know who Simon Kinberg is, this is going to be some interesting context for you, because I think that based on who this person is, right, you'd feel differently if, for example, Aaron Sorkin said he was going to write another Star Wars movie, or Steven Spielberg was going to direct the next Star Wars movie, right? So who is Simon Kinberg? Well, Simon Kinberg, for those of you who have been following the comic book movie space, is actually one of the, I would say, more influential producers on a lot of the X-Men movies. I believe he was a producer on almost all of them. He wrote, and he wrote a lot for the X-Men films, and I'm going to list what he wrote, because I think it's an interesting insight into I don't know, maybe the level of quality we might be expecting, although maybe not, because obviously writers can have a good day and have a bad day, with their script, so who knows. But I think that the kinds of projects that he wrote for the X-Men franchise are quite interesting. He also directed an X-Men film, which we also talk about. And he also, in terms of Star Wars, executive produced and co-created, I believe, Star Wars Rebels. So that's the Star Wars connection there, right? I don't doubt that he's a Star Wars fan. Obviously, anyone coming into the Star Wars universe is, has to be at least a fan of the lore in some sense, right? So it's not like he's completely new and he's completely out of the loop there. But returning to the X-Men franchise, because if it's true that Simon Kinberg is going to be writing these films, which is it's what's been confirmed in this report, I think that we should go over what he has written, especially in terms of these big blockbuster projects, and then see how it stacks up here. So let's go through his credits here. I'm just going to go through the whole list here. So and I'm going to really only touch on the more notable ones here because I think that, there are some films here that I don't really recognize, but I think the more notable films here will have a kind of a bearing on what's going on here. So he wrote Mr. and Mrs. Smith, the Brad Pitt, Angelina Jolie kind of infamous movie. Pretty well received, I believe. I haven't seen it myself, but I believe it was pretty well received. The first X-Men movie, though, that he wrote is X-Men The Last Stand. Now, that is not great because most people seem to think that X-Men The Last Stand, myself included, is probably one of the weakest X-Men films that they produced. And I would tend to agree. It's not atrocious. And I'm sure, and actually not sure, I know there were a lot of other bits of drama that went on with that film, especially with Brett Ratner, Bryan Singer. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure Simon Kinberg didn't have the easiest time, but he did write X-Men The Last Stand. He also wrote Jumper, though. And just checking out the Rotten Tomatoes score for Jumper, it has a 15%. So that is not encouraging at all. Again, every writer, every director can have, bad scripts that they write and bad movies that they direct. So it's not, it's not a nail in the coffin, as I'm sure we'll touch on in the next coming films. But it's just interesting. The next film he wrote was Sherlock Holmes, the one with Robert Downey Jr. And that one is actually, I haven't seen it, but it's a film that, is generally well received. So that's pretty good. He did not write X-Men First Class. He was a producer on X-Men First Class. Skipping down here, he wrote, then the next film he wrote is interesting. The next film he wrote is X-Men Days of Future Past. And this is interesting because the two films that I've highlighted thus far, X-Men The Last Stand and Jumper, well, actually three films. X-Men The Last Stand, not great. Jumper, pretty bad, according to critics. Sherlock Holmes, pretty good. X-Men The Last Stand, though, is, I maintain, one of the best comic book movies ever made. I love X-Men The Last Stand. And he wrote the film. And so we have to give him, he is the sole writer of X-Men Days of Future Past. That's a big credit to him, right? It shows that he is capable of doing really great things. And so I give him full credit for that. That's awesome. Then he wrote Fantastic Four, the Josh Trank Fantastic Four, which again, I know he seems to be getting himself in a lot of productions that are troubled. His Fantastic Four obviously had a really troubled production here. So, I mean, how much of it is his fault? I don't know, whatever. But he was a writer on Fantastic Four. So, yeah, there is that. The next film he wrote was X-Men Apocalypse. Again, one of the weaker X-Men films, I would say. But then he did produce some of the X-Men films that came after. He produced Logan, he produced Deadpool 2. So that's interesting, right? And then he made his directorial debut with Dark Phoenix. And I will say this. If Dark Phoenix is not the worst X-Men film I've seen, it is probably one of the worst X-Men films I've seen. It is, in my opinion, not great. And so the fact that he wrote and directed Dark Phoenix is something that gives me a lot of pause. It gives me a lot of pause here, especially heading into something like Star Wars. And that's pretty much, that's the extent of his credits here. Now, like I said, he wrote some episodes of Star Wars Rebels. He is an executive producer and co-creator of Star Wars Rebels. So that's also encouraging, at least for some, because I'm personally not a big fan of Star Wars Rebels. But for some, a lot of people love the show, and that's great. That's great. So we'll see about that. But again, I just am a little bit hesitant here on the Simon Kinberg front because, again, he's done some really great things, X-Men Days of Future Past, for example, but he's also not had the best track record of writing, producing, directing. So we'll see. It depends on who he gets to collaborate with and, who he surrounds himself with as he works on this project. But then, to close out this segment, let's get to the really, the elephant in the room here. Is this even going to happen? And look, if you're out there and you believe with all your heart, you truly believe this is going to happen, that's awesome. I'm so happy for you. I can't bring myself to be at that point anymore because just look at everything that Star Wars has done that they've canceled. Taika Waititi's film, who even knows? Kevin Feige and Michael Waldron had a film that was going to come out. That's not happening. Benioff and Weiss had a trilogy that was coming out. Rian Johnson had a trilogy. It's not even like these are individual films that got scrapped. You know, Patty Jenkins had a film. These are trilogies. They planned trilogies with Benioff and Weiss, who did Game of Thrones, and with Rian Johnson, who obviously did The Last Jedi. They planned trilogies with them. So just because, you know, there's this news report that comes out that says they're planning a trilogy, that to me, I mean, maybe normally, right? Not in Star Wars right now. It would be an indication like, oh, they're serious about this. But guys, I mean, they've canceled entire trilogies before just like that. And obviously not to mention the quote-unquote drama with Rogue One, which I love Rogue One, so it turned out great. But then the drama with Solo, A Star Wars Story, and all these other things, and you know, Rise of Skywalker and Last Jedi, and it's like all these things. I don't know. I'm not even talking about quality, right? We're not even going to talk about The Acolyte or anything like that, because those shows came out, Ahsoka, they came out, right? We're not even here to talk about, you know, what I thought about those shows. You can check out all my thoughts on the YouTube channel. But just in terms of can they make it happen, I don't know. I really don't know. We just talked about last week that the Rey Skywalker movie was getting delayed, and it's like, when is enough, you know? Where we have to just be like, the boy has cried wolf, you know, too many times. And I don't know. We'll have to see. So guys, there are a couple questions here. First of all, what do you think about this news that Simon Kinberg is going to be the one who is running this trilogy? Very interesting. Second question for you. Are you excited about the trilogy, and what do you think it's going to be? Is it going to be a Skywalker film? Is it going to be episodes 10 through 12? What do you think about that? But the third question, probably the most pessimistic question, is this even going to happen? I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts in the comments down below.